Hey everyone, Tactics here, and with Season 2 quickly approaching, I figured it would be a good time to take a look at all of the interesting new loot options for tanks coming in the new patch, both from Raids and Mythic Plus, and just kind of give my thoughts on how some of them have been looking through testing on the PTR. So this includes things like weapons that have unique effects, offensive and defensive trinkets. I'll cover both of them separately, as well as the other very rare pieces available in the Raid that are usable by any of the tank specs. A couple of things I want to note here quickly beforehand. A lot of these opinions are, of course, tuning dependent, so things could change between now and launch if Blizzard chooses to buff or nerf some of the good or bad options that I list here. Also, something else to keep in mind is that we weren't actually able to test any of the trinkets or items that came from the 4 old dungeons, so that's Vortex Pinnacle, Neltharion's Lair, Freehold, and Underrot, but I'll go through kind of what those trinkets are, at least for 3 out of the 4 of those, because Vortex Pinnacle, we actually don't really know what those trinkets are going to look like. The loot table hasn't been fully updated in the dungeon journal, so I'm going to skip Vortex Pinnacle entirely, but for the other 3 old dungeons, we can at least look at what those trinkets are going to be and kind of talk about maybe how strong they were back in the day for all you boomers. Now, with that said, let's get into it, and I'm going to start off with some of the more interesting weapon drops available, as well as the very rare cape from the raid. So to start off, there's a couple one-handed options. The first one, something a lot of people have talked about, is Forge Storm. This drops from Neltharion. It is a one-handed mace with no primary stat. That's the big thing to note. There is no primary on this, so it can be used by any of the one-handed classes here. So you've got Brewmasters are able to use this. You've also got Prot Warriors and Prot Paladins as well, so decent number of tanks here that can use this, and basically your attacks have a chance to ignite Forge Storm for 12 seconds, and then during those 12-second procs, your attacks explode for extra fire damage, split between all nearby enemies, increased up to 5 enemies. The one thing I found in testing is that this is a pretty inconsistent proc rate, so you'll have like some pulls, for example, where this will absolutely pop off and do a ton of damage, and then some pulls where this will proc literally 0 times, so it's a bit hit and miss, and not having the primary stat is, of course, a little bit unfortunate, but the other problem really is that you're going to try and have to get this from your Mythic Plus vault if you want it at the max eye level, right? Because this is a Mythic Plus drop, so you'll be able to upgrade it to base Mythic eye level, but if you want to get the highest weapon available to you, then you'll need to hopefully RNG this from the vault, or maybe as a tank player, you just want to take something more consistent that has primary on it. Speaking of something that has primary on it that is a one-hander, there is something from Underrot actually coming back here. Let's go open it up. There it is. Underrot has the Bile-Stained Krog Tusk. So this does have primary, but this has no secondaries. Usually it's actually much less of a big deal because primaries are in general more valuable, but this also has a much more consistent proc to it. Your melee attacks have a chance to poison the enemy for some nature damage over 9 seconds, and it stacks up to 3 times. And this is usable by, of course, Brewmasters again, not by Prot Warriors and Prot Paladins this time, since this is an agility weapon, but Demon Hunters, because it's a fist weapon, are also in the mix here. So again, very, very good weapon. You have to get it from Mythic Plus though, and so if you want this at the max eye level, you're going to be really, really hoping you hit one in the vault, which is going to be happening for much fewer people than are able to just craft, say, an item at the max eye level. And whether or not this actually makes up the eye level difference between a crafted item and like a base mythic eye level item is kind of up in the air, so you'll have to be simming that on a case by case basis. Now, other items from the raid that are weapons here, we've got Jarun, a Pillar of the Elder Flame. This is a very rare polearm coming from one of the bosses in the raid here, and it is of course available to Guardian Druids and Brewmaster Monks again. So there's a two-handed weapon. A pretty nice proc here. You can ignite it on a 2.5-minute cooldown, and you deal fire damage and cause your melee abilities to unleash waves of fire split between all enemies struck for 10 seconds. So you get a bit of extra fire damage during that proc. So both good in single target and AoE. And then finally for weapons, we have Eshkander, which is a drop off of Neltharion in the raid, a two-handed sword. So we've got another cool two-handed weapon coming here, and it's basically got regular stats as well as a chance for your auto attacks to do extra shadow flame damage, and the damage is doubled against humanoid. So pretty nice weapon for blood DKs here. The benefit of this too is it is not considered very rare, so it will have a regular drop chance compared to something like the weapon before it, Jarun. Hopefully I'm saying that right. But the power level is not as high, I would say. It's probably a little bit more on par with not Gavel. Gavel's much stronger. I would say probably closer to Jathis, maybe even a little less than that. But still, very solid weapon and the highest eye level available because it is from Neltharion, the second last boss in the raid. So it's going to be at 450 eye level on Mythic. So very, very powerful weapon there for Blood DKs. Finally, we do have the cape available from the last boss, Sarkareth. And basically this just steals stats, a small amount of the lowest secondary stat from 4 allies and gives you a ton of your best secondary, or highest secondary stat rather, for 8 seconds. Also, notably, it doesn't have stamina on it, which isn't the end of the world, but it is notable, especially for tank players. So those are the unique items. This is going to be pretty good, I'm sure, just because it's going to be so many stats. However, whether or not you're going to get that, because again, it is a very rare item. I don't know if tanks are really going to be a priority to get this item in a raid group either, so you're going to probably, again, be hoping for your vault. So it's not going to be probably too common, but still very, very powerful nonetheless. Next, let's talk about trinkets. And before I get into the defensive versus like offensive trinkets, I do want to quickly talk about the Neltharion trinket. So Neltharion actually drops class-specific trinkets. There's a bunch of classes on each set of trinkets here. And again, these are very rare, so you're probably not going to see these too often. But I do want to quickly touch on these. So you've got 3 different ones here. So first, we've got the Death Knight and Druid one. So this is a flat verse trinket that has your harmful debuffs, and periodic spells and abilities grant you some primary stat. And also at the same time, you'll get a Shadow Dot for 12 seconds. Luckily, this Shadow Dot is pretty tame, especially with the health values players currently have, so you won't really notice it too much. So there's not much of a downside to this trinket. Pretty nice, of course. It's a little random. I think I was averaging between 20 and 30% uptime on this primary stat buff, so it's nice, but it's not something you can really rely on, and it's not super consistent, which is usually something tanks like, but it will be a lot of damage for sure because of how much primary it is, and because if you want damage, you don't usually aren't too concerned with when that primary stat is coming. So a little trade-off there. Next, we have the Neltharion's Call to Chaos. That one is for Paladin, Warrior, and Demon Hunters here. So this is flat crit, and this means your area of effect spells here have a chance to proc that primary stat, but it also increases the damage you take by 5% for 18 seconds. This is by far the heaviest drawback on these trinkets. Just a 5% flat damage taken increase the whole time you have it up is definitely not ideal for tanks. Plus, the trinket gives flat crit, which is not ideal for any of the 3 tank specs on this trinket token, whatever you want to call it. So, it's not too great. It's definitely the worst of the 3 in my opinion. Similar uptime to the previous one as well, the like kind of between 20 and 30% in my testing. So really not an ideal downside. Obviously, if you're looking for pure damage, definitely a very good, very, very good option. But if you're trying to think about a trinket you're going to use consistently, especially in harder content, taking 5% increased damage at the wrong time is very, very bad. So maybe not so great there. And then we have the last one here, which only Brewmaster monks are on. This is a haste trinket, and basically you'll gain these stacks of domineering arrogance, and then when you use your major cooldown, which I believe for Brewmaster is considered Ox, you'll get some amount of primary stat per stack that you've gained, and also you'll reduce your move speed by 10% for 10 seconds. So again, not a terrible drawback here for Brewmasters, maybe a little annoying in situations, but this actually turns the randomness of these trinkets into something that you know when it's going to happen, because it's always going to come with Ox, and actually really, really boosts the power of Ox if you have this trinket. I actually really, really like how this trinket functions for monks specifically. I think it's definitely the best out of the tank specs. So definitely a really, really nice option for Brewmaster monks if you're able to get your hands on this very rare trinket. Now, I want to break the trinkets down a little bit by category outside of this. So I've got a few stat sticks, and then I'm going to talk about offensive trinkets, and then I'll talk about defensive trinkets. So to start off with the stat sticks, nothing too crazy here. You've got 3 of them. Notably, this first one is actually a very rare trinket from the first boss in the raid. So this is just primary stat. All 3 are available, of course. And the proc here is crit and leech. They also has a 3-minute cooldown on use ability, which basically just kind of negates fall damage and does a minuscule amount of damage when you do so. But it can be nice in very certain situations, so that's kind of cool. Overall, pretty solid proc stat stick. Nothing much to talk about here. If you like crit, this is going to be probably pretty solid. Boosted eye level as well, since it's very rare. Next, we have the Ominous Chromatic Essence. This one also comes from the raid. I believe the Forgotten Experiment boss drops it, and basically this has primary stat on it, and then you can pick the secondary stat by talking to, or attuning rather, to one of the Oath Stones in the Dragon Owls that we did at the beginning of the expansion. So you can pick what secondary stat you want this trinket to have, and then it kind of adds like the Whispering Incarnate icon from Vault of the Incarnates, where allies that are attuned to a different Oath Stone will give you a little bit of the stats that they have. It's not a lot, it's 58 stats, but obviously if you have all 4 or whatever it is available to you, you get like what, 150-ish, 180-ish extra stats, which is not too bad at all. But again, that means you have to have 4 players with this trinket that have 4 different stats, right? And you can only get benefit from each stat one time. So pretty cool. Should be hopefully easier to get than the Whispering Incarnate icon. But again, in the same vein, it's not over budgeted as much as the Incarnate icon was. So keep that in mind. Lastly here, for this that we have and been able to test, is the Iridius Fragment. This is a flat mastery trinket, which gives you a ton of primary stat on a 3-minute cooldown for 20 seconds. But this primary is reduced every time you use an ability. So potentially very good for bursting and burst damage if you need burst damage in a certain situation. But usually this is something more DPS oriented in terms of stat sticks, and something tanks tend to shy away from, because usually you don't really want this on a 3-minute cooldown. You want something much shorter, or you want something that just has no cooldown whatsoever, right? Like the one we just mentioned before this. So probably not going to be used too much for tanks across the board. Maybe very, very niche, like parsing or burst damage, that kind of thing. There are a couple from the older dungeons here that weren't tested. So Underwrought, we've got the Vial of Animated Blood here, another mastery stat stick that has an on use that gives strength, and only strength, I believe. So this is only usable for the strength tanks. And this strength will decay over 18 seconds, and it has a 1.5-minute cooldown. I have no recollection of this trinket back in Battle for Azeroth, but there it is. This could be something maybe that is more interesting for something like a Prot Paladin over the Iridius Fragment, right? You get twice as many uses out of it, and you could, pair this with wings or whatever. So could be interesting depending on numbers here, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. The other one, which is very, very well known, is Harlan's Loaded Dice. This is an agility only, so only the Brewmaster, Vengeance, and Guardian will be able to use this. And basically, you just have a chance to proc a variation and of Mastery, Haste, and Crit for 15 seconds. This was very powerful, had very high uptime back in Battle for Azeroth. Very sought out the entire expansion, basically. So this is a trinket that's definitely pretty hyped for people. People are very, very excited to have this trinket back. So probably something that you're going to be looking for just for generic stat value, but maybe not the absolute best thing to use, but a nice passive kind of set it, forget it, get a bunch of extra stats trinkets. Now, let's move on and talk about some of the specifically offensive options available. So a lot of these are going to be, of course, DPS trinkets, but as we saw, both in the first patch of the expansion, as well as all throughout Shadowlands, it's not uncommon for tanks to just throw on some DPS trinkets, especially if you don't need more defense. So, starting with the raid options, Elementium Pocket Anvil was very, very undertuned in all of my testing, so didn't really look good for any tank spec. Basically, how this works is some of your commonly used attacks have a chance to proc extra Shadow Flame damage on hit. For Paladin here, as you see, Hammer of the Righteous and Blessed Hammer. For Warrior, for example, with Shield Slam. So abilities are going to be pressing fairly often. And then on use, on a 1-minute cooldown, you can do a tiny bit of Shadow Flame AoE damage, and then increase the damage from your procs by 20%. Until you leave combat, stacking up to 5 times. So this will take you 4 minutes, basically, to stack up to the maximum stack. So it kind of puts in a space where, you want this on like longer raid fights, maybe, where you can actually stack it up. But even then, the proc rate was pretty low, in my opinion. But this is something that could get boosted up by tuning. But looks like something that's going to be more preference to longer raid fights as opposed to Mythic Plus, where you're going to be leaving combat all the time, maybe not with Spiteful, but in general, you're going to be leaving combat a lot. So you're going to be losing the stacks you're building up. So the value on that one's probably not going to be too good in Mythic Plus. Moving on, we've got the Zakali Chaos Grapnel. This is a strength-only trinket again, and basically this throws an anchor at your target. It pulls you to them, deals some damage to them, and then some AoE damage around them. The damage was not really too exciting, but it was a cool effect for sure, though. 20 yards is actually a lot shorter than I was expecting it to be. It's really not too much of a gap closer. Neat idea, though. 1.5-minute cooldown as well, so it's not terrible when it comes to damage if you're just using it kind of on cooldown, but it's not really anything to write home about. Then we have the Dragonfire Bomb Dispenser, another agility-only trinket, but this thing was absolutely blasting when it comes to raid testing and stuff like that. Across the board, dealing a ton of damage. So basically what this does, the on-use, is you throw a bomb on your target, which will blow up after 7 seconds, and if your target dies before that bomb expires, it blows up and deals split damage to everything within 10 yards. You store 3 bombs at a time. These bombs recharge every 30 seconds. And when you actually use the on-use itself has a 10-second cooldown before you can use it again. So you can go through all 3 of your bombs basically in that 30-second time. You'll get 1 back at the end of that, so you'll have a 4th bomb to use. But also to regain bombs outside of waiting that 30 seconds, critically striking 60 times will give you another bomb. So pretty cool trinket. I like this trinket idea a lot. It was dealing a ton of damage. Obviously, it's a DPS focused trinket, but if you're ever a tank spec that doesn't need to be defensive and wants the extra damage, and you're an agility spec, obviously, very good damage option. Probably the best damage option here in terms of just consistent extra damage for a tank spec. Then we have Beacon to the Beyond. This is from the last boss, Sarkareth, in the raid. A flat mastery trinket that has a 2.5-minute damage cooldown that is kind of like a little AoE that deals increased damage up to 5 targets, but it's split. This is insane burst. This is a ridiculous amount of burst damage. So if you specifically need burst damage to deal with something, whether that's in raid or Mythic Plus or whatever it is, this is the biggest amount of burst damage you can do. It's not going to be as much damage as the Dragonfire Bomb Dispenser, but obviously the strength classes can't use this, so they don't have that option. And the agility classes are still like, maybe they do want to use this if they specifically need burst. So this also a very strong DPS option, specifically if you need burst. 2.5-minute cooldown. It also has a cast time, so beware of that, kind of like Puzzle Box. So it's a little annoying, but still extremely powerful whenever you do need bursts. Then we have some underwhelming trinkets here. So the Homeland Raid Horn from Alderman and the Frenzying Signal Flame. Okay. Just got that one. Flare, rather, too. From Brackenhide. Both these not great. This is an on-use here that just does some AoE damage over 3 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. And then this one is just a random proc where you sometimes summon a null. Very low chance, by the way. Very low chance to summon a null. And then that null can either like do physical damage to your target and stun it, poison them, or give you some secondary, your highest secondary for 20 seconds. So very inconsistent is the biggest problem with this one. And just underwhelming in general is the problem with this one. Mutated Meg Mammoth Scale was pretty decent in terms of just a passive set it and forget it damage option. Now, whether this is going to be some better than something like Harlan's Loaded Dice, like we talked about previously, is still kind of up in the air, but it was actually a pretty decent just passive damage option here. So just a little bit of a frontal fire damage to all targets in front of you. Again, damage increase up to 5. Pretty standard thing they're doing here with a primary stat on it. So not a terrible option, definitely better than most of the other dungeon options. So if you're only doing dungeon stuff, this is probably, this and Harlan's are probably like the 2 biggest ones right off the bat that you're probably going to be aiming for in terms of damage. Finally, another Agi-based one here, only for agility users. This is an on-use, and you can basically throw the spear. It deals fire damage, which is split between all enemies in the area, and then it gives you a stacking crit buff for 10 seconds, up to 5 based on the number of targets hit. So it's kind of a mix between a stat stick and an on-use damage thing. I put it here because the on-use is pretty decent. It's not as strong as some of these other on-uses here, like the Anchor, or like I said, even the Meg Mammoth Scale, whatever, the non-on-use here. But it also gives you that crit, right? And again, it's on a 1.5-minute cooldown. Lots of 1.5-minute cooldown trinkets here, which is pretty interesting. But this one, it's just kind of okay. I think I would definitely probably prefer the Meg Mammoth Scale here over it, just in terms of raw damage. And this one's also from Neltharion, as is the Meg Mammoth Scale as well. So those are some of the damage ones that we know about. And I believe there's also one here from Legion's Neltharion's Lair. Let's go and look at that real quick. The Mark of Dargrul here, so it's just a crit on the trinket, and then your melee attacks have a chance to trigger a landslide, dealing physical damage to all enemies directly in front of you. Downside to this trinket, it's crit instead of primary, and it's physical damage instead of a magic damage, so it'll be mitigated by armor. Upside is that it's potentially uncapped, so it could be very, very good in a certain target count, but I'm not too optimistic just looking at this for now, that this trinket's going to be too good for a tank spec. But who knows? Could be very, really strong based on tuning. So we'll have to wait and see. Now, offensive trinkets done. Let's talk about defensive trinkets. Again, I'm going to start with the raid trinkets. So off the first boss, we have the Enduring Dreadplate. You cover yourself with 5 plates. Basically, you get 5 stacks. And then each stack reduces your damage taken by an amount, and also your move speed, so you are a little slower. And these last for 15 seconds. If you take a big hit, it'll destroy one of the plates, and then that destruction of the plate will shoot Shadow Flame damage at enemies in front of you, uncapped. And then notably that this can only happen every 2 seconds, so you can't just chain lose all your plates. So that's actually good defensively for the trinket, because you'll maintain those stacks at minimum for 10 seconds if you're constantly taking those bigger sized hits. In general, I actually don't think this trinket is too bad. I need to do some more testing with it, but I was kind of optimistic about this trinket, especially because it does the uncapped damage. It's a really low number is the problem. Like that 13,768 Shadow Flame damage, that's a really low number. It is uncapped, but it just didn't feel like it was hitting too hard. But it does still have a decent amount of defensive value from those plates, assuming you're able to, hold on to those plates for a little amount of time. So it's not bad. I'm not writing this trinket off just yet. I still want to do some testing on it, but it definitely seems interesting. It's also on a 2-minute cooldown. I don't know if I mentioned that, but interesting here from the first boss. So it should be accessible for a lot of people too, since it does drop early on in the raid, maybe even accessible to a lot of people on Mythic that other trinkets wouldn't be. Moving on, we have the Ward of Faceless Ire. This is from Neltharion. This is a trinket that can drop for anyone, and basically has a 2-minute cooldown on use, where you can put a big absorb shield on anyone, including yourself. And basically, if that absorb shield, which lasts for 10 seconds, is actually broken by damage, you get to do a little bit of Shadow Flame damage to the target that actually broke it. I don't see this being used a lot by tanks. I just don't think it's going to happen, given that we have some other options I'm about to cover. But it's cool that you can maybe, have some utility if you want to, a healer wants to equip this, or a healer and a tank wants to equip this, and you actually use this shield on someone else in a Mythic Plus dungeon. Could be a play for sure. I'm kind of interested in that aspect of it, but in terms of a personal tank defensiveness trinket, it's not going to be used, I don't think. Moving on, we have the Inexorable Resonator from Alderman. This is a stamina trinket, so that's already a big tick against this trinket. And then falling below 50% health activates the Matrix for 12 seconds, which makes you have a high chance to counterattack when you take damage for some fire damage, and then you absorb the next X amount of damage you take, and it can only occur every 2 minutes. Again, stamina, and 50% is actually a relatively high proc number, so there's going to be a lot of times, depending on our tank spec too, but like a DK, for example, this is just going to proc on cooldown. That's not necessarily a good thing, right? So again, I don't think this trinket should get any use unless the fire damage done is insanely overtuned. Otherwise, it's just kind of meh, and you're losing a lot of primary or secondary stat by having a stamina stat trinket. In terms of really strong defensive trinkets, Treemelt's Festering Splinter. If anyone remembers this trinket, it was actually used in Mythic Raid progression at the beginning of Season 1. That's how good it was. You could only get it on Mythic 0, and it was still used. You basically deal a little bit of nature damage to yourself, and then you get a big absorb shield for 15 seconds that absorbs 50% of your damage taken over that time, and it's only on a 1.5-minute cooldown. So you actually get very consistent use out of this trinket. Very powerful defensively. Probably currently the strongest defensive trinket available in the season as of current tuning. So that's definitely a trinket tanks are going to be looking for if they want something a bit more defensive. Moving on back to Neltharion's Lair, actually, there's a couple tank trinkets here. Shard of Rockmora is another one that seems very interesting. Primary stat on it and a 2-minute cooldown on use, where you basically get to absorb some damage from each attack up to a certain cap for 30 seconds or until you hit that cap, right? So very interesting trinket there. Going to entirely depend on tuning. Again, Neltharion's Lair, we see what the trinkets are. We have no idea what their actual numbers are, what their actual tuning is at. So we'll have to wait and see what that's like. But I'm actually excited to kind of test this trinket out because this one seems very, very promising. There's also Talisman of the Crag Shaper. This is a verse trinket, and the on use is a 1 minute cooldown here, so even shorter, and it prevents 50% of all damage taken for 15 seconds, up to, again, another cap. This cap does appear to be significantly lower than the shard cap, which is why I'm a bit more excited about the shard than I am about this Talisman, plus, of course, primary versus a secondary stat. But still, the tuning dependent could be a very, very interesting trinket. There's one more trinket I want to look at here when it comes to defensive stuff. That's going to be from Underrot here, if I can find it. There it is. We've got the Lingering Spore Pod here, another primary stat trinket, and this makes your attacks, and then attacks also made against you, a chance to grow a spore, which after 4 seconds will burst, healing you for a pretty significant amount and dealing some damage split among nearby enemies, again, increasing based on the number of targets hit. So entirely tuning dependent, because we haven't been able to test this, but this is a pretty interesting option when it comes to wanting mostly defensive, but also a bit of damage depending on proc rate and depending on what those final numbers are. Could definitely be interesting, but again, we just don't know because they haven't been tested. And like I've said, Vortex Pinnacle, we haven't looked at any of those trinkets. We don't even know what they're going to be in their final form at all, so we'll have to wait and see there. But there we have it, guys. The most interesting trinkets, weapons, and other loot coming for tanks in patch 10.1 from both raiding and Mythic Plus. As always, I want to give a big thank you to all of my supporters over on Patreon. I couldn't do this without you. We've got a ton more content planned with the season coming up so soon. In my next video, I'm going to be talking about all of the loot system changes, the big overhaul that's coming for that, and explaining how it's all going to work for both Mythic Plus and raiding. Of course, I've got my guides. I've got my Mythic Dungeon guides. I've got my raid guides for normal, heroic, and Mythic. Of course, my tank spec guides as well, all releasing very, very soon. So be sure you do subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications if those interest you so you don't miss out on those. You can also always check me out on my Twitch channel where I stream Mythic Plus and raiding from a tank's perspective, including a lot of PTR stuff to prepare for the next week or so for the new patch. And of course, when the new patch actually comes, new dungeons, new raid progression. Really, really excited for that. Otherwise, thanks guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.